Good morning. We're ready to start. Our next session is Making Strides While Facing Tides, Current Climate Data and Louisiana's Path Forward. I am your moderator, Christopher Tyson. It is great to be with you. I want to thank CPEX for inviting me to yet another Smart Growth Summit. This is an awesome convening that means so much to the work that we all do, and it's great to be with you again. I am the president of the National Community Stabilization Trust. We work nationally to advance affordable home ownership as a way to build community wealth, stabilize neighborhoods, and advance racial equity. Prior to serving in this position, I was the president and CEO of Build Baton Rouge, our city's redevelopment authority and land bank. I want to thank our sponsors, WRKF, plus all of the summit sponsors who are listed in your program and in the slideshows between sessions. The summit would not be possible without their support. I also want to remind you that this is a CLE-approved session. If you would like information on how to obtain CLE credit, please see the staff at the registration table outside. We're going to begin today by me sharing with you the panelists' bios, and then we're going to begin presentations. Our first panelist is Don Bain. Don works as senior advisor at Climate Central Incorporated and is a licensed engineer and expert on climate change, adaptation, and sea level rise. Dedicated to building a bright future in a dramatically changing climate, Don is a highly accomplished business executive and management consultant. He has managed hundreds of projects and has experience working in 21 countries. Don is an expert on the implications of sea level rise and has advised municipalities on adaptation, risk management, and economics and finance. Joyce Coffey is the president of Climate Resilience Consulting and has 25 years of leadership experience in government, private, nonprofit, philanthropic, and academic sectors. She has worked with over 200 institutions to create and implement climate-related resilience strategies. Joyce's firm is a social enterprise that works with clients to create practical strategies that enhance markets and communities through adaptation to climate change. And last but certainly not least, someone who needs no introduction to this group I know, Andronika Morris serves as Executive Director for Housing NOLA, a 10-year partnership between the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance, the Foundation for Louisiana, the city's Office of Housing and Community Development, and dozens of public, private, and nonprofit organizations working to solve New Orleans' affordable housing crisis. She has assisted in creating opportunities for approximately 500 families to become first-time home buyers after Hurricane Katrina, and she was the lead organizer for the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliances, when it started in 2007. Without any further ado, I'd like to invite Don Bain up to give us a presentation, and that will be followed by a discussion where I will invite the other panelists up and we'll share some on Don's presentation and a number of other topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning. Good morning, Louisiana. Very proud, privileged to be here. Thank you. So I tried to reflect on something appropriate for Pearl Harbor's Day, as Mitch did, but I instead couldn't get past my experience during Hurricane Harvey, where I was within 30 miles of the eye of that storm in Texas. And instead I have to say thank you for the Cajun Navy. So I am with Climate Central. We are a nonprofit. We are a bunch of scientists, and in my case, an engineer, one of those people gets made fun of, and proudly so. Computer scientists, computational experts, etc. We do science. We do all things climate, but we're particularly good at, I think, sea level rise, and provide tools and data to much of the world. In fact, the world that can't afford to have their own dedicated modelers and scientists. So we've done some work lately that I am very proud of, and I think you'll find interesting, as the press has as well. It's focused on the risk to our local tax base in the United States. To tee this up, the awareness of sea level rise is increasing. Now it's often as a result of a storm event. In May, 4 houses in North Carolina fell into the ocean. The New York Times took notice. It was an instructive event. Now these houses were second home for rich people, frankly, but still they had some interesting data that helps inform what is going to happen. So moving one of these houses 35 feet up slope and away from the ocean would have cost $185,000, according to the Times. After the house fell in the ocean, the owner, of course, lost it. But then they got a bill for $57,000 to clean up the mess associated with it. And that was just 4 homes. Next door in Alabama, we have properties that are currently underwater. These are as a result of erosion. Erosion and sea level rise are highly correlated. We can discuss that afterwards. But these property owners are still receiving property tax bills, and some of them are actually paying them. So we're hearing stories about that all around the coast now, where property owners are getting bills for land that they can no longer use. So this problem that we study, of course, goes beyond the storms, but it's really the ever-increasing sea level rise that is affecting, frankly, all of us. So one aspect of this particular round of analysis, we do analysis all the time, but in this case, what was unique is that we, for the first time, asked the question, how does this changing tide line affect the boundary that we use to divide between private property and public beaches and public waters? So that's an interesting aspect that hadn't been done before. That boundary is defined by each individual state, and laws that are quite complex and nuanced. However, they can all be related to more or less standard tide lines. NOAA did that for us. This is a diagram that shows a cross-section of a beach where certain defined tide lines intersect the beach. That forms that boundary between private property and the public tidelands, public waters. So we use that in our analysis. As I said, we think that's the first time that in particular has been done. We combined it with a number of climate scenarios. The one I'm going to show you today is something called SSP 3.7.0. So this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the sea level rise model associated with that climate scenario. And this climate scenario best matches our current performance, i.e., if we keep doing what we're doing now, we can expect this. At this scale, this graph looks a little bit benign. It shows a gradually increasing water level, but I assure you it's not. I also have to make the point that in no model scenario at this point does the sea stop rising. So at this point, we're committed to sea level rise. The only question is how much and how soon. The other point I need to make is that this rise is going to continue for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. That's already committed. So the numbers, just to give it some context, our friends at NOAA said you should do this, Don, when you talk to people. The West Coast can expect just over a half a foot. That's by 2050. That's the global average. But sea level rise is not distributed equally, much like the future. So on the East Coast, we can expect about a foot of sea level rise, maybe a little bit more. Florida gets about a foot. However, Texas, with subsidence, gets about 1.5 feet. And unfortunately, Louisiana gets almost 2 feet by 2050. So why 2050? Well, that's within range of a 30-year mortgage now. People can relate to it. Most of you are going to be around at 2050 to check Don's work here, which would be interesting to see. So I'm going to show you some reporting at the national level. Strap in, this is going to be a little bit clinical for a few minutes, but bear with me. So here's a graph. The way you read this graph, that x-axis along the bottom, those are individual counties, 505 of them in the United States. And it's organized alphabetically. So on the far left, that's Alaska. So it's state and then county name alphabetically. And on the far right is Washington State. The y-axis is the percent, or the fraction rather, of the county that can expect to be underwater at 2050 with this particular climate scenario. So 0.5, which is right in the middle of that graph, means 50%. 50% of a given county might be below the elevation of the water at that future time. So we looked at 505 counties. The numbers add up to almost 5 million acres that would be below the high tide line, and that's 7.7 thousand square miles. Now, for reference, that's more than the state of New Jersey. And when I give this talk in certain places, they go, so what? We won't miss New Jersey that much. I'm like, no. This is distributed land losses all across the United States. Also, when you look at this graph, and this was surprising to us because we swim, eat, bathe in data all the time. There, you see a big clump that's just left of center. That was surprising to us. It just, outside of our normal consciousness. Well, it turns out that's Louisiana. So you're probably not surprised, but we were. Florida gets all the press, it seems, but the data shows that the problem is much greater in this fine state. So this graph I just showed you was the high tide line. This graph uses the same analysis, but it's that boundary line around the country. So it's virtually the same numbers. However, some of the states use the low tide line rather than the high tide line. So if I reorganize the data in a little different way, I warned you this was a little clinical. We form what's called a Pareto chart. So this is the same data, just organized greatest to least. And when you look at that, you see, the problem's relatively concentrated. There's, out of the 500, there's over 100 that have a material loss. And this is 2050. When I run the numbers out to 2100, it's the same shape. We lose 2 New Jerseys by then. The problem is, as I said, not equally distributed. So who gets the worst of it? Florida comes in first with the number of properties below the tide line. Louisiana is second. Now, we that do this all the time, I warn my colleagues, let's not be too clinical. This shows 140,000 properties falling below that tide line, that boundary line. But each one of those properties means people. So there's an owner there, and most often it's a couple. And almost all of those people don't know what the data says. So what's coming, they're not aware of. And the people that are going to buy their properties, or perhaps their kids, they don't know either. When I continue below to tease through the data, this is the number of properties that will be 100% below the tide line by 2050. And here we see it's over 25,000 in Louisiana. That's a complete loss. When we do it by land area, unfortunately, Louisiana makes the top of the graph. When we do it by county, these are counties in the United States. Now, before we published this data, we briefed a number of organizations, including NOAA and CPRA. And CPRA said, wait a minute, Don, Terrebonne Parish has got a levee system that your analysis doesn't know about. And they're right. So the people at CPRA know better than IPCC, NOAA, and Climate Central. So I defer to them, but still, we've got a big problem. 16 of the 30 top counties in the country are in Louisiana. We have to go down to number 12 before we get to, it looks like Virginia. Then we have some in North Carolina. And then we begin to share the problem. This is an interesting view of the data. Those two straight lines are the number of properties and the square miles of the properties. You can see they get generally worse linearly as the water goes up. But look at that purple line. That purple line is buildings. And why is that? Remember, buildings first, that's where people are. They live and work there. But why that sharp acceleration? Well, that's because we love the water and we build our stuff close to the water, and the margin of safety is now going away. And when we experience a problem, it gets worse very fast. So we released this, we published a national level report, but we also released this at individual county level. So you can go online and download a free copy of the data for your particular county from a website page that looks like this. Here's the URL. You can generally get to it just by Googling sinking tax base, but it's climatecentral.org/tools/sinking tax base. Now, that's how we released the data, but we did the data. We did the analysis on an individual property by property basis, 52 million properties across the United States. It took the computer systems 6 weeks to run the first time we submitted the model. Here's an example. This is not Louisiana, and I covered the names so you can't Google these poor people. Ralph and Joan bought this place in 1992 for $152,000. We know how much it's on the tax rolls for now. It's a commercial property, so I don't know the estimated retail market value of it, but that yellow house in the background is on Zillow for over $1 million. We know when that property is going to go below the water line. That's the red line between 2040 and 2050. And those are the values associated with the tax associated with it. If we were to get our act together, we could postpone that by perhaps 10 years. This would be the results if we achieve the Paris climate agreement targets. But, you know, it's still got our property. So let's talk about the implications of this. Now I won't bore you with slides. First, there's a big implication for tax revenue. And of course, tax revenue, local property taxes, is how we fund our local government operations and our schools. So the way we fund things locally are going to take a big hit. And not only do they take the hit on the revenue side, but they also, this happens when the expenses are likely to go up. These are expenses you're probably already experiencing, having to do with fixing stormwater systems, repairing roads, generally taking care of the infrastructure. So this is a major challenge that's coming to how we finance and organize our local government. Secondly, we're talking about the loss of property. You know, people, especially Americans, have this really strong affinity with their property. And if you've been out in the country, you know, this is the temperature of the country is high. Can you imagine going out telling people you're going to lose your property? I don't think that's going to go very well. And the scale of the problem is huge. There's tens of thousands of people this is going to happen to. Some of them, by the way, are lawyers, so that's going to be interesting. And it's going to generate a great deal of controversy that's going to show up in our court system. Now, we've got time. The good news is most of the judges and lawyers that are going to adjudicate this are in daycare right now. Perhaps elementary school, but still, there's a big wave coming. And I had a couple of other things to point out about the implications of this. First, Little Climate Central did this. Now, we're scary, smart people, but we're a small band. You know, if big moneyed interests did this kind of analysis, and it's completely doable, they're going to know what the neighbor's house is worth, when it's going to happen, et cetera. So while we like to think we're wearing white hats, there's other players that are going to get involved, and this is going to get interesting, and we're going to have to deal with it. The other big implication is that people will move, and this kind of goes to the heart of this conference, but not all people are going to move. And first, I encourage you to look at Matt Hauer's new paper. It might have come out, but it will soon, that describes the implications of that migration. It tells us that the people that will move first are the ones that are economically very fit. They're the young workers that professionals that generate taxes, raising families, et cetera. Leaving those behind who don't have the resources, and often leaving the seniors behind. So to all of us, particularly all of us in this community, we need to acknowledge the crime that is climate change. And we need to acknowledge how bad it is. But we have a responsibility to also understand that with these changes will come opportunities. And those opportunities look like economic development. They look like jobs. They look like growth in the places these people move to. So we as this community need to learn to articulate the language of finance, investment, jobs, economic development, et cetera, and do so in a way that we don't leave behind the people who can't come with us. Our warriors don't do that. We shouldn't either. I'm out of time, but I can't leave the stage without making some requests in front of an audience like this. As I said, I'm a proud engineer. I hang out with the coastal engineers in the United States, and we're tired of you guys calling the Dutch. I love the Dutch. I lived there for 4 years, but our engineers are just as good as they are. Louisiana, get in the game. Our engineers are just as good at managing water as they are. Let's do this. Secondly, and this one's a little tedious, but we have kicked the can so far down the road on climate remediation that we cannot achieve our targets without capturing and storing CO2. We don't yet know how to do that at scale. That's a whole industry that needs to get developed. There are new business models that needs to get developed, and great infrastructure that needs to happen. But to be in that game, you have to have geology on your side, and you have to have infrastructure. And Louisiana's got that. You can own this industry. You've already got the Henry Hub for natural gas. You could have the same for CO2 storage. And lastly, I'll leave you with this. The physics of what's going to happen are non-negotiable at this point. So it's not a question of if, it's only a question of how much and how soon. To all of us in this room, I want to reflect back on that point earlier. We have to not only describe, articulate the danger that is coming, but we need to learn the language of investment and economic development, and we need to commit to leave our brothers and sisters, to not leave our brothers and sisters behind, and bring them forward into this bright and proper future that we can expect together. We'll be much better off if we make that just and equitable. We know that. The Louisiana that we know today doesn't look like the Louisiana of yesterday. This is yesterday's picture. Here's today's. The one in the future will look different as well. I encourage you all to embrace this change, find and make the best way forward out of it. This group is the group of people who has to start and lead that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. I think that has set the stage for what is going to be a great conversation. I'm going to ask that the panelists come on stage and have a seat, and we're going to begin with the discussion. Should I take this mic? It's okay. Okay. Thank you. Great. We all have microphones. Incredible presentation. Sobering data, but empowering when we think about our ability to plan and work together and come up with solutions. Joyce, I'd like to start with you. When we stride forth in Louisiana today and think about the future and think about our children and all that they're going to have to contend with, those who are in preschool and elementary school now, who will indeed be on the front lines of addressing these issues. Joyce, what is one thing Louisiana needs to do in 2023 to address these issues, to help bolster the pride we have in Louisiana and our ability to solve big problems? Who needs to be involved in that one thing?
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Let's see, is this on? Thanks.
Yes.
I think that the one thing that is extraordinarily important for Louisiana is to remember something that I think everyone in their heart here knows, but we need to think about it really carefully and feel it deeply, and that is that climate change is not fair. Climate change hits first and worst to our frontline communities. And just like climate change is growing in intensity and frequency and duration of extreme events, the impact that climate change is having on frontline communities in Louisiana is growing in frequency, intensity, and duration. And this is true around the United States, but when I say it in places like Miami Beach, they look at me quizzically. And I just want to pause for a moment because I think that everyone in this room knows what I'm talking about. So if that is true, it is true that the disproportionate impacts on climate change make racial inequity and socioeconomic inequity so much worse. The one thing we need to do is to target our resources, especially our public resources, towards decreasing inequity through more affordable housing in safer places, through better public health access, through more access to power to get your mortgage secured, power to have tenants' rights, power to send your kids to schools that you feel are good enough, not just good enough, that are great, and so many of the other social systems that we need. But it really starts with that very clear mission to target resources towards creating equity in the face of climate disruption.
Great, excellent. Don, you shared so much with us. Based on this expertise and the experience you have, how can and will Louisiana lead in solving these challenges going forward?
First, everyone, apologies. My segment was brought to you by the antidepressants manufacturer of the United States. I'd like to be more positive now. Louisiana got dealt some tough cards as this problem laid out. With that bad news comes the opportunity. We need desperately leadership. We need people to show us how it's done. As I do my work and as I talk to a variety of stakeholders around the country and around the world, there are a great many people who want to help, especially Wall Street. Wall Street tells me we have money we want to put to work. We're eager for projects. Tell us how. And then they explain, yeah, it's got to make all the right returns, et cetera. So that's why I encourage all of us, A, to show their leadership, but B, learn the language of economic development, learn the language of finance, engage, and bring the people along. Why this group is so important is because of the equity and justice dimension to it. Because I know you will make sure that doesn't get left out while we go about building a new coastline for the United States. And the scale of that problem is huge. We're going to need everyone. We don't have time anymore to argue with each other. I wish this stuff hadn't gotten politicized. let's get on with it. So I think that's enough.
Well, we certainly want to hear more, but I want to get Andronika in this conversation as well. Andronika, I could begin rattling off a number of issues that are present right now in the housing space, right? The lack of supply, the rising rents, the widening economic inequities and the gaps, the stagnant racial homeownership gap, right? So many issues. Talk to us about how housing plays in this. We know, as Don has shared, right, that this is going to first impact people where they live. And we know that reverberates to so many other areas of our lives. So talk to us about the housing implications of what we're facing.
Sure, thanks, Chris. And Joyce started down that road really well. So did Don, he brought it back together. But what I want to remind everybody about in this room is that, as Don mentioned, we have a little bit of a head start here in Louisiana because of some bad luck, because of Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, Isaac, yada, 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 right? We got a lot of a head start on resources to invest in, but one of the things that we have been struggling with is to properly prioritize and to stabilize people. Despite all of those massive investments, we have not put housing first. Right? We've gotten billions of dollars to help people rebuild their homes, and we have not had the hard conversations, those equitable conversations with community about where their homes are and where their homes need to be. Instead, folks have been kind of cast to the four winds and not given the chance to return equitably. Forget about deciding where you get to live and how you get to live. You first couldn't even get someone on the phone to get a blue tarp put on top of your home. And so you've got to deal with that first. We've got to say, what it means to be a Louisianian is first and foremost that you live here, right? That's the big piece that's missing as we hear our policymakers and our elected officials talk about addressing climate change. We've got to start talking about what it means to be a Louisianian, what it means to live in community. That means your address. And so whether you're a renter or a homeowner, how is that guaranteed? How is that sustainable? And how is that community resilient given the very harsh and drastic realities of where sea change is going to impact what the next hurricane is actually going to do? So first we've got to say everyone who wants to live here gets to live here, and they have to live here in a safe, decent, affordable, resilient home. I mean, we're having policy conversations. A month ago, I was having a policy conversation where state officials are still maintaining the lie that FEMA will not allow you to rebuild a house back to higher standards or better standards. That's not true. That's just not true, right? And it leans into these ugly stereotypes around housing that somehow after disaster, you should not be given, quote unquote, I'm using my air quotes here, you shouldn't be given something that you didn't earn. And we've got to deal with that. If we don't start talking about this, that everyone needs safe, decent housing that is resilient, that will protect them from the next disaster and allows them to remain a Louisianian, then who gets to stay here? As we've been watching with Don, we were watching all of these second homes go into the drink and the loss of tax revenue and things like that. We can't keep focusing on those initiatives or on those examples. Those people manage to get the most press. They have lawyers, they can sue. What about the people of Louisiana? Because eventually it will bleed up to the average working class, middle class folks. It's not just concentrated in disenfranchised communities and fence line communities and people who live in Cancer Alley. It will eventually get to everyone. And that's why we say, put housing first. That's why we say we have to guarantee housing first and figure out that housing has to be safe, right? We can't just put people where it's affordable to live and where it's affordable for them, and with no concern about what's going to happen when the next Ida rolls through. when the next Laura and Delta rolls through? What happens when there's a hurricane, the next winter storm Uri, and their utility bills go through the roof? We have to be more thoughtful, and we have to be really bullish around this, which is why we are.
That's great, and it kind of takes our discussion in the direction of thinking about what are the tipping points that we might see in the future. We know we have infrastructure vulnerabilities, right? A power grid that is maybe not resilient as it needs to be, a backlog of infrastructure projects that we hope will be funded, but that takes years to come about. And in that time, another hurricane, another disaster, and here in Baton Rouge, we know it doesn't have to be a hurricane to flood the whole city. Right? There are all types of vulnerabilities there. We know that we in Louisiana are wrestling with an out-migration problem, right? People after each disaster don't necessarily rebuild. They don't choose to stay here. So as I think about all of these vulnerabilities, the insurance crisis, right? The politics of ongoing federal support for this level of disaster mitigation assistance, particularly as the nation, the disaster mitigation needs grow everywhere. Talk to me about what you think a tipping point might be and what types of solutions we need to focus on now to get ahead of that tipping point.
Anybody?
Anyone, jump in.
Well, in a lot of those areas, Chris, unfortunately, the tipping point's behind us. It doesn't mean that we can't undo the damage, but that's what has to happen, right? And because we didn't act. Insurance is a perfect example. 17 years ago, after Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of conversation about what it meant because the country hadn't seen anything like Katrina when it came to the loss of the impact, the damage, the scope and the scale of the damage, not just here in Louisiana, but across multiple states. We had not seen anything like that before. Our insurance industry was not ready for things like that before. I mean, we had folks who insured, they got flood insurance with the concept in places, low-lying areas like New Orleans, conceiving of 4 to 5 feet of water, cutting out the drywall, and the water being pumped out. Not conceiving of water to the roof line sitting for 45, 50 days. And the system was not prepared for that. And instead of looking at the insurance industry and really figuring out what was going on with it, it was very politicized, and what we heard everyone kept saying, our elected officials kept saying, well, you don't want Florida's system. We don't want Florida's system. We don't want Florida's insurance system where the program like Louisiana Citizens was disproportionately used in Florida, and it was the insurance of last resort, and the state of Florida would be on the hook for so much damage if something else happened. Fast forward 17 years, we have a system identical to Florida's. Because we didn't actually plan to do anything different. We just told folks they didn't want something that looked equitable and easy, but we didn't strategize to do something that would actually change the system insurance in Louisiana. We've kicked the can down the road on flood insurance, right? We've got these new FEMA maps that are fairly unyielding, and the consequences are hitting it's a perfect storm. This is another storm that we could have interrupted that has been climate intensified. And so we're past the tipping point on insurance. A 63% increase across the board, we're past it. It's behind us. What we have to look at is walking very carefully on the other side of that seesaw and tipping it back or getting it back in balance. And that requires strategy, honesty, and centering the needs of community. Again, we've got to say everybody can't live everywhere because of what's coming and what's already damaged that neighborhood and that community. But where can you live, and how do we increase mitigate the risks? We live where we live. We need more people in communities to share the cost, to share the burdens of sky-high insurance, and we're still not having those conversations.
I endorse that. I want to remind everybody the FEMA methods that generate the flood maps are excellent. There's nothing wrong with them from a technical approach. However, they do not include sea level rise, so they seriously understate the future risk.
So they're actually more conservative or more generous.
More generous, right. And because of the nature of the pricing of the program, you're still not paying through the premiums the actual cost of the risk. So we're holding our breath. We're, once again, kicking the can down the road. The insurance industry I work with a lot, explaining the data, explaining the science, and they're not there. They're really focused on the next 2 years and think about how they operate within a regulated environment. So there's this need for strategy that you describe with the stakeholders at the table to design how this might work in a very different future where the actuarial data we have no longer applies because we don't live in the same climate that I was born into.
Yeah, I think that's so, isn't it interesting to hear Don say, Don from a nonprofit, Don, very smart guy, that he's having to educate the insurance industry, which is the industry that we rely on for information around risk. So I always find that so astounding, and I think you're very much right. So I want to just think about this tipping point from the perspective of making strides, something that needs to happen like tomorrow. I believe strongly that the state of Louisiana is in such a good position to leverage more money to flow into the state to the right kind of projects, by which I mean targeting funds towards building equity, if you have an institution that actually helps with that. And some states have already figured that out. They have what's called a green bank or a climate bank. The likes of New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland's bringing one on. Of course, California has one. What it would look like in Louisiana would be wonderfully different. It would be a Louisiana concept. And that might mean that, for instance, you'd be able to woo more private capital into those extraordinary projects that the governor talked about relating to renewable energy. You'd be able to woo more private capital, Don just mentioned Wall Street, into things like a fairer, affordable housing in communities that are safer. Because Andronika just pointed out, it can't be in all of the unsafe places. We have to be investing in some of the safer places. It can also be to combine projects so that you make the capital more interesting, the project more interesting, because a lot of investors, it's kind of small potatoes for them when you come to them saying, well, we want to do one of those amazing parks, like what Mitch said. No, the investor wants to see that you're doing 15 of those. So the point of a Louisiana Green Bank or a Louisiana Climate Bank or a Louisiana something like this is that it is actually legislated at the state level, and it allows for leveraging the money that you already have, including those federal dollars that we're hearing a lot about already this morning, as well as bringing in more private capital into equitable-based climate action for housing, for communities, for healthcare, and for infrastructure. And I really think that I'm so inspired by this. I think this is the moment for this tipping point to really create something that not only will our kids in Louisiana feel great about, but we actually can see benefiting us in the next decade.
That's great. I want to hear more about green banks. And I saw Don nodding and Andronika nodding, and I'm thinking about the examples in California and Connecticut and other places. Can we talk more about the specific features that we would want to replicate in those models, and what uniquely we need for Louisiana, and where those models aren't innovating? That we can provide a model. So talk to me about those three things. The things we want to replicate in the existing green bank models, the things that are uniquely Louisianan that we'd like to see featured in such an approach here, and those things where we have an opportunity to lead.
I'll defer to the people who are more articulate and smart than me.
Okay. Well, one thing that we are, again, ahead of the game, Louisiana does have a green bank. It is the Finance Authority of New Orleans, is the only green bank in the state of Louisiana already. So we are already leading in this issue, but this is also a really good example of, to Chris's point, one of the challenges and problems that is uniquely Louisiana, right? We tend to innovate around these kinds of issues in places like New Orleans, which unfortunately means that the rest of the state is not going to do it, right? Y'all ready for some real talk today? Right? So New Orleans did it, that means nobody else is going to do it. We got to stop that, right? We have to stop that. And thankfully, there have been some progress made on that matter. I sit on the board of the Finance Authority, and I'm really excited about the fact that the Finance Authority is in talks with folks at CPEX and other people across the state to talk about what a Louisiana Green Bank could look like. Now, at the same time, what can't happen is New Orleans also can't be left out of any Louisiana Green Bank because we have our own Green Bank, or in the name of New Orleans not sucking up too many resources, which is, again, something else that happens. And so it's looking at the plans, it's looking at the investments that we desperately need in places like New Orleans, in the home of Thibodeau area, and Lake Charles, and Alexandria, and Shreveport, and Monroe, and setting standards. We do have a set of recommendations from the state around climate investments. We have everything from the watershed initiatives to the coastal master plan. And again, Camille talked about this morning, the work that CPEX has been doing in places like Gonzales. What are the local strategies? Because this does need to be hyper-local. That is one issue that I think we can do really well, that you've seen a problem in other larger areas with these kinds of initiatives, is it tends to be a lot of top-down and it doesn't fit the local communities, right? We've got a lot of similarities. We all love Louisiana, but again, the way these kinds of initiatives will play out in the river parishes, for example, is going to be different than the way it would play out in Monroe. And that doesn't mean that you should be pitting these communities against each other for resources. You should allow them to adapt and customize based on their needs. And so we'd like to see more of that, and we'd like to see more conversations had at the local level about resiliency. And I will say one other thing. We were fortunate enough to get some resources last year to do some polling, to do some focus studies, focus groups across the state, and it's astounding because I want to make sure everybody's encouraged by the fact that our communities are ready to make these investments and to make these changes and to have these hard conversations. What we often hear about Louisianians is we're all too wedded to the oil and gas industry. We're too wedded to our distractions. We're too wedded to being, our race to the bottom with so many things. We're a red state. We won't do these things. That's not true, right? What we found, what the analysts found, was that most Louisianians across party lines, across social and economic areas, yes, there are people who are climate change deniers, the QAnon kooks, those folks, yeah. But I'm talking about folks who you typically lump in and just don't get it. They do get it. What distresses them more than anything is they don't think their leaders will get it. They don't think their leaders have the will and the vision to do what's necessary to save this place.
That's great.
Yeah, that's great. So just a few things that I think that we could borrow that are best practice. One, there's state revolving loan fund money that goes through these banks, and it really gets maximized. So I know, Louisiana uses that money well too, and that's, EPA federal money that comes down, and it can go to all of the parishes if it's meted out properly. I'll get back to that in a minute. The second thing that I think is really important that these green banks do, the best of them, is that they not only fund energy-related investments, but they also fund human-related investments, so they're about community resilience in addition to being about infrastructure and other really big dollar things. And the third thing they do, just wait here for a moment, is that some of them actually work on raising taxes and rates. And the reason why that is so important is that these are banks, after all. And the reason why private investors might be afraid of a place like Louisiana is that you haven't done a lot to raise revenue. When you have an investor, he needs to be paid back. And there is more than enough assets in Louisiana for that. I mean, not just the financial assets. I'm talking about this glorious place, all these wonderful people, the potential here. But I do believe, and I know I'm not that popular when I say it, that things like a penny tax, which you can borrow from some of those places that have green banks, is something to be conceived of like now for the future. Because part of your question was, what do we need to put in place today in order to be better for the future? A few things that these other banks aren't doing, just to list three really quick. One, to get to Andronika's point, and I think Andronika would know how to do this, I'm just going to say what needs to be done. I don't exactly know how to do it in Louisiana, but the bottom line is green banks are generally a bunch of white elders, males, who are making decisions. And in Louisiana, if we continue in that way, a green bank will just further the problem that wealth begets wealth. And that is not equitable. It's not the D, the E, or the I that we heard from Mitch. So we need a more community-based approach to green banking in Louisiana, and maybe the New Orleans
Fano model.
Fano model could be helpful in that regard. And then the second thing is, and also related to this, it is a new era, at least for the next 2 years, maybe for the next 10. The Inflation Reduction Act, in addition to the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act that the governor mentioned, flood huge amounts of money to the state of Louisiana. And the federal government, and that money comes for 10 years, so that's where that 10-year money, that 10-year timeline comes from. Currently, the Biden administration has a Justice 40 initiative. The Justice 40 initiative says that 40 cents of every dollar, every taxpayer dollar spent of the federal money needs to go to lower resource communities. And in fact, for both Infrastructure Jobs Act and Inflation Reduction Act, you can get 100% federal match if you're doing a project in a community that has very high need. They have high need because they have been underserved historically forever. And so what an incredible opportunity. The Green Bank could actually help to elevate the needs of lower resource communities, listen carefully to them, and actually begin to create equity through resilience and through climate action.
That sounds like a plan to me, Joyce.
Let's get working on it.
Let's continue talking about this because Andronika brought up the reality that on the ground, people know what's happening in their communities. And we know from places, obviously in the New Orleans area, but the Baton Rouge area, the North Shore, there are communities who we don't think of politically, socially, economically, racially, as being open to thinking about climate change, right? If we look back the last 20 years, we've had a very politicized conversation that has racial undertones, that has class undertones in this country, and I think all of us have the baggage of, oh, I wonder if these people are going to get it and going to be in a coalition with others. Andronika, you give us a window into maybe a different narrative that we need to think about. And Joyce, you talk about the opportunity to channel these funds towards these equitable gains. And so I want to delve a little deeper into, number one, what is it going to take to have these cross-racial, cross-class coalitions come together? And how do we avoid the risk, Joyce, of climate gentrification, as we're seeing, right, and in other places, and the risk that wealth will beget wealth, right, and we will miss this opportunity to kind of have a coming together of different people in different stations to address this problem that all of us are going to face.
So I guess, Don, you want to go?
Please jump in, Don.
Okay, we'll go first and come back to you. So I would say, Chris, one of the things that's got to happen is that we have to start listening to locals. There are leaders across the state, people in communities like the Sharon Levines, right? These leaders on the ground who are saying, this is enough. We can't take any more of this. And then we've got to start talking about having real conversations with policymakers and elected officials and holding them accountable. Like I said earlier, we have a lot of elected officials, you just talked about it, who have really misrepresented the people of Louisiana in their how they've gotten themselves elected. That's their shtick, is we're dumb, we're hyper-partisan, we're hyper-racialized, and we are those things sometimes, but not all the time, and certainly not when a hurricane is running us down. Certainly not when a flood event, a rain event is pushing people out of their homes, right? The water doesn't care. Water doesn't care. And so what happens is we respond with those biases and those prejudices, but we all get hurt initially. And when we can have, that's the opportunity to have the conversation with the folks that we think we can't talk to those oil and gas workers, to those offshore workers who are making so much money and coming back to a home that's been destroyed. And saying to them, listen, it's not about you losing your job. It's about doing what's right so that you have a home to come back to, so that your family has someone to come back to, and talking to them about job opportunities in realistic fashions. I mean, on the other side of the issue, the green industry does a terrible job messaging these issues. Just a terrible, terrible, terrible job. If I have to sit through one more conversation where people talk about jobs in the oil and gas industry not being good paying jobs, I'm gonna lose it, right? I'm just gonna lose it. They are good paying jobs. They're not a lot of them. That's what we talk about. We all kind of lean into the notion that they're the majority of our economic base, when any analysis of our economy tells us that oil and gas jobs are nowhere near the majority. They're a very shrinking minority. So let's talk to the people who are working in hospitality, who are working in hospitality across the sector. Like, when I talked to a friend of mine about hospitality being one of the biggest sectors, they're like, really? I'm like, yeah, because you count fast food inside of hospitality. And they're like, oh yeah, that's right. And those jobs don't pay a lot. You have people across different spectrum, and let's talk to them about different opportunities and also what's going on in their life every day that is when those storms come, because those folks don't have paid leave. So when a storm comes, they don't get paid. Even if their job is just closed for the day and they can go back to the work next day, they've lost a day of wages that they can't really recapture because of that storm, because of that event. So let's talk to those folks about what's really happening in their lives and how this shift can really make their lives better. Not in a theoretical way, not just because we're gonna save the planet, but in very practical ways. And that's how you started having those conversations, listening to local leaders and having real conversations with the people you think you can't talk to.
Great. Don?
2 points. One, thank you for that. Absolutely. We have lost the narrative with regard to, this issue of fossil fuel jobs. Go to Net Zero America project at Princeton. Download and look at that. It talks about the transition we have to make, and it quantifies the jobs that are going to get created as a result. Many of which are skill identical to what goes on in the oil and gas industry. So there's just a false narrative out there. Go with the science. Secondly, I'm a big believer in borrowing good ideas that work elsewhere. The international development banks have a mechanism for their projects in conceiving a large-scale projects like we're talking about when you get up above the neighborhood level. They do something called technical assistance, and technical assistance is seed money to organize the projects that need to happen that achieve all of the goals to create the payback for the investors, but also to achieve the other functional and feasible requirements for the projects. And they do something with something they call they use something they call safeguards that take care of the equity piece for nature, indigenous people, et cetera. There's a lot we can learn. It's been well developed. We should take advantage of that and use it as an accelerator to take some of this money that Joyce is identifying and put it in a work that in a way that can scale up beyond just the next project. Over.
Yeah, I think it's a great question with probably a lot of awesome answers, but also a lot of uncertainty around it, to be frank, because I mean, wouldn't that be great if we had figured that out 200 years ago, 400 years ago, 400 years ago, let's start. But I did want to just come back to two things that I heard this morning. One, the story of Gonzales made me verklempt. I mean, I didn't know that about Louisiana. What I know about Louisiana, I'm not from here, I love this place, and I think about it as being a place of struggle. And what CPEX has done is turned it into a place of thriving, at least in the context of many of the planning processes that they have touched. And I really think that is profoundly important, and we have to build off of that success. The second part of that, and it is related, is that Mitch taught us a lot this morning. And one theme that I heard was an elected official appointed a very powerful person who was able to target taxpayer money to lower resource communities. And he did that by first identifying the incredible inequity and unfairness of the existing system. There is something to our vote and then holding our elected officials to power, the power that they have to make that targeting happen. And I do think it's really profound that Louisiana has a governor who actually has the first climate plan in the South that is very explicit about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and is explicit about adaptation and says a little bit about equity. I think it should also be the other way around. We need elected officials in Louisiana that say, this is weird. Why is our state a debtor nation? Why do we continue to have so much inequity? I really feel profoundly that it's possible that we could see Louisiana being a different set of power if the local that Andronica is talking about here and the Gonzaleses and the planning processes all reminded us of targeting resources towards underserved communities. And one way to do that, because I'm telling you a lot about what should be done, but how do we actually do it? I think CDFIs, Community Development Finance Institutions, they're working really well in some communities. I don't know how they would work in Louisiana. Oh, there's a big no there. Okay, I won't go further then, because I trust you. Okay.
That's another panel, right?
It's another panel. It's another panel.
Cut me off.
No, this is great. Donna, I want to go back to you, and I know we're kind of zigzagging here. We have maybe 20 more minutes. I want to go back to one of the most compelling slides you had was the kind of by county analysis and seeing all of those Louisiana parishes kind of at the top of the list. I think you said you had to get to number 12 or so before you got to Virginia. And we need to organize. We need political leaders to step up, and those are cycles of politics and electoral politics and bureaucracy and change that may not happen fast enough, given the level of urgency that I saw in that slide. Talk to me specifically about that, because to have that level of concentration, that's a national issue, I think, to see the risk so concentrated in one state. Talk to me. Am I overstating that, or
No,
how should we
you've
think
got
about
it. There are areas, and there are areas in the country that are going to suffer more sooner than others. And as a result, Louisiana is a result. One way to look at that is how terrible that is. It is. And it's a problem of the scale that's hard for a Terrebonne or a Plaquemines to solve on their own. Those people have to go somewhere. Now, in the past, we're not sure where they went when we lost them as a result of a storm. But you see, and I have to make it very clear, Climate Central does nothing with regard to policy. So I'm not advocating any particular policy. I'm just reporting, some observations. We've seen local governments in Florida, for example, band together across counties and begin to work some of the problems that, as you say, the water doesn't care. And as those people move, they're going to go somewhere. They could very well be going to high ground in Louisiana. So there's perhaps opportunity for some of that pairing and economic development that happens as a result of that movement of people to be managed or managed. So.
And I love that answer. One of the things that I, and I don't see Camille, but she and I would have this conversation a lot when I was at Build Baton Rouge, was thinking about the planning implications for those communities in Louisiana that may be receiving communities, right? Yeah. And what the implications of that would be for long-term planning. And so when we think about housing as a state policy issue, as a local policy issue, as a market issue, and most importantly, Andronica, a community issue, right? When we think about the future of housing in Louisiana in the face of these challenges, how should we be thinking about the higher areas that could potentially receive our fellow Louisianans, and what does that mean for local government action and planning?
So we've got to talk about the first part of that. Immediately makes me nervous because of the NIMBYs, right? The not in my backyard folks.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we think about terms like, I know we got a lot of planners and in the rooms, but terms like density and how it triggers people. Because, again, people start thinking in these very binary terms. The pie is not big enough. These scarce resource frameworks that just aren't really real, right? Mm-hmm. And so people moving into their communities, evacuees, climate evacuees, I hate using the term refugees, talking about American citizens inside of America, so I don't say it. So I say climate evacuees, moving from a community to community and receiving communities. So they're citizens. They get to move there, they get to vote there, and so they need to have their voices heard there. And what at the end of the day, Chris, what we're lacking desperately is the leadership to navigate this, right? To say, number one, our communities are struggling where you might be a receiving community. I'll talk about my hometown of Edgard, Louisiana, right? Very underdeveloped for most of my life. Seeing other places develop, despite the fact that it's 18 feet above sea level, nestled against the levees, inside of the wetland protection, and very, very, very underdeveloped. It's also in the middle of Cancer Alley, right? So the idea of what does it take to attract people to a place like Edgard, and do we want to attract people to a place like Edgard, and to have that honest conversation, because if we don't grow, it's going to die. It won't be there anymore for anybody to take advantage of. So how do you have that conversation respectfully? You need to be leadership. That needs to be done with leadership instead of what we keep doing is leading with industry, right? Saying, okay, we need to put things in Edgard, like a grain silo, before the Formosa settled on Welcome as the place it was going to put itself, it was going to be in Wallace before it was going to be in Welcome. And the fact that Formosa has been playing a 30-year game to get itself into the river parishes, and that's the only way we think about it. We only think about those kinds of investments. So our leaders have to be thinking about our communities growing and an opportunity to welcome people who can contribute to the society, change it, it's going to change, and grow it so that it is sustainable and so that folks are living a little closer together. For one big reason, we talked about insurance. The more people you have in a neighborhood, in an area, your insurance rates go down because it's being spread amongst more people. So there are real practical issues, but then you hear the NIMBYs are like, well, this is my community, and I don't want to share it with someone who has been pushed out of another community, that turf war. That, again, will cost you your community, because if we don't stop this stuff.
Yeah. And who may not look like me, or may not make as much money as me, or may not vote like me.
All right. And a very real, you talked about climate gentrification, the also very real worry of, in communities of color, white people discovering, oh, wait a minute, y'all 18 feet above sea level, there's nothing but black people out here, let's plant our flag. And you're gonna be a minority where you were a majority. People are very afraid of that, rightfully so. So again, maintaining that equitable distribution of power and say so is something, again, that requires leadership. And too many of our leaders are afraid of having those hard conversations. They'd just rather do nothing than do something that will anger the folks who elect them into office.
So let me give a quick shout out to planners. So this problem is terribly hard, but as I said, some smart people can go out and do this modeling. This is a case where we can see the physics tell us what's going to happen. So everyone's going to move. Not only the people who you might have called refugees, whatever, but the accountants and the shop owners, and everyone's going to move. And the longer we put this off, those people are going to move first. You need to think about how we bring along everyone, including the ones that are so important to our growth, our tax base, et cetera. So, does that make sense?
Absolutely, and you certainly paint again. There's a lot to be excited about in this conversation. I don't want to highlight the negative, but you give us a window into a dystopian possibility where wealth, armed with information and resources early on, flees.
I'm telling you, it's possible, yeah.
Yet leaving those least mobile, right, most vulnerable, right, there to deal on the front lines of these issues without the tax base of the wealth that has left, right? And we should also mention that wealth usually has more political capital. They get more attention from policymakers and others. And so we could see a dystopian view where these communities are kind of hollowed out with the resources that they need to address these issues. There's no one left to organize with, Andronika, and others who kind of bring the mix of capital that you need. And then we have that issue to deal with. And Joyce, I think that's part of what you're concerned with as well.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I don't think, and we can't call it dystopia. This is the future of this place. I mean, this is going to happen. There's going to be a panel here in an hour that we're going to crack the code on this. We're going to find an answer. But a couple things that I'd like to contribute to it are, in addition to what you just litanized there, the people who do not have the agency and grace to move because they have lacked power for so many generations are going to need many more social services. Mm-hmm. And so when you talk about NIMBYism, they are going to arrive in a community and they are going to have needs. Right. And mm-hmm. we are not nice. Mm-hmm. We are not nice and we are not fair and we will not provide for those needs. In fact, we will be pissed off that they are taking from what our community already has. Unless we do something today to make the receiving community so vibrant that they are like other American cities that are like, we need you. Literally, we need you. We need you because we have so many jobs. We need you because our schools need a few more kids. We need you because our insurance base needs to be stabilized. So that receiving community planning, I mean, again, Louisiana could be in the lead for the nation because no one has figured out how to do this. The Carolinas are a little bit, they're coming along, but what if all the parishes were working on this together, looking at the physics and looking at the demographics and really using the incredible planning resources to, I'm pointing at CPEX there, to come to terms with the fact that, for instance, elevating properties is a disastrous way to create resilient communities, but creating receiving communities that are vibrant, maybe through a little bit more density, but we won't talk about urban because then urban, they think, oh, black and it's going to be dangerous. No, beautiful, wonderful communities for everyone. We have to do that literally tomorrow because they are moving. They are moving and they're not moving into places that are comfortable. They're not moving into great affordable housing. So there's all this money out there for the federal government right now. Louisiana, take that money and put it into your receiving communities so that they can really want the newcomers.
Yes, this is great. We are in the last 10 minutes, which is a lot of time. But I just want to give you that preview and let us start kind of wrapping up. And I just want to focus on some solutions. We've heard a lot of solutions here offered, from green banking to local organizing. And so I'd love to start with you, Don. As you give this presentation in various communities to various groups around the country, what are the solutions you're seeing them attached to? What do people get out of receiving this data? And what would you share with us today that you think are your top things that we need to be doing?
Well, first, I thank you all for suffering through what looks like a lot of bad news. I'm an optimist, otherwise I couldn't keep going back to work every day. The biggest indicator I have for optimism is my climate scientist kids. The climate scientist friends. They're still having kids. When they stop having kids, which is the ultimate investment in the future, then I'm going to get really, really scared, and we're not there yet. I'm also an engineer, and so I look at this problem as one of opportunity if we get our act together and do it the right way, including the topics that we talked about today. If we treat it as just a problem, then it's often going to be too little, too late, and just one series of misery after the other. I'm encouraged when I see groups of people like this come together and begin to work the problem. As Joyce said, we don't have an answer in an hour, but we have a lot of intelligence and good spirit in this kind of a group, and we need you to keep doing that. There is the possibility to make for a better America and world than what we built previously if we get our act together and go about it the right way.
Great, great.
So I do want to say to everybody here that we have to start thinking about, particularly for those of you who are in planning positions, we always, whenever I come to this conference or talk to planners, we know that there's a lot of frustration because there are folks with good ideas and they can't figure out how to get folks to listen to them, right? And so you've got to manage up and you've got to be able to manage out, right? Up, your bosses, out with community. And what I always want to urge people to do from those positions is to first listen, not go and share all the information that you have. Listen, because I cannot stress this enough. Community are the folks you need the most to get these kind of initiatives really adopted. It's not your bosses, it's not the elected officials, it's community. It truly is. Because if those people could do it, we'd have done it by now, right? They're lost. Community who is living with these consequences and is really struggling with this, they, one, can clearly articulate their crisis, their needs. You can hear them and you can find partners with organizers and advocates and community itself who can then help you talk to your bosses about the investments and the strategies that need to be implemented. And Joyce made a point that I want to make sure is really, really hit home. Louisiana has, I started talking about it earlier, we are really the best situated to change this. And I know that's the most incredulous part about this, I think, right? Not just the depressing stuff is kind of like, okay, that's us. We're struggling. We're the worst. Got it. Everybody's like, yeah, that's right. But we can actually be the best. We can be the best. Say it again. We can be the best. And we have to be the best, because if we are not the best, if we don't start leading on these issues, if we don't figure out how to get community to help us hold these knuckleheads accountable, we're going to be the first ones off into the drink. Like everybody loves watching the Bugs Bunny cartoon of sawing off Florida. That's not going to be what's first, right? You saw that map. You see the map. When we see the real map of the coastline, we're going to be first. So we're either going to be the best, we're going to lead, or we're going to self-fulfill the prophecy that Louisiana can't get it together. We can't get past our differences. We can't get past our issues. We can't think ourselves out of these problems. And y'all all know that's not true. So we all got to start acting like it is, in fact, a lie. And that the people who you all want to serve desperately, they are truly the answer. They are truly who, and they are the point.
They are the answer and they are the point. That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm just going to come back to making strides while facing tides and think about something you asked in the very first question, Chris. I think you said something about youth. Mm-hmm. And I just want to come back to youth because I think that Louisiana's youth have a really hard row ahead. That's No joke, especially if you are Black or low income, all around the state. I also know that youth have so much energy to make their future better, and I want to ask whether, because the culture of this place, the social elements of this place are so incredibly important, if there wouldn't be a way to harness the hope and drive and fury of youth to acknowledge culture while allowing for change. And what I mean by this is, yeah, we talked about Cancer Alley. In Cancer Alley are beautiful families of many generations that have extraordinary culture and stories. And those things can remain even if people have to leave. If we had a system where we could acknowledge this and put up a plaque about all that happened here, the wonderful meals, the incredible thriving, the births and the deaths and the fights and the furies, it might be kind of interesting because that's what many other cultures in the world are facing, but we think about them from the perspective of like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Pakistan. Actually, right here in Louisiana, we could actually have youth in Louisiana celebrating this culture and all the great cultural and social richness, even as the significant transformational change needs to happen of moving away out of harm's way and making strides away from the physical harms that climate change is bringing.
I want to echo Joyce's points about youth because in a few hours, like many of you, I will go pick up my children who are in 3rd and 5th grade. They don't have the emotional baggage of having, watched Al Gore talk about all of this 20 years ago and the climate denialism of the last 20 years and all the politics and all of the wasted time and all of the urgency that has come up. We need to lean into this today, but ultimately, we won't be the only ones addressing these issues. There is a generation that is experiencing this in real time. They don't have time to quibble over, is it real or whose fault it is. They will be the ones making bold choices that some of us may disagree with, but they'll be in control. And that gives me hope. It gives me hope for my home state, it gives me hope for the nation, and it gives me hope for the world. So I want to end on that positive note. Thank you all for sitting with us in this conversation. Thank this incredible panel. And thanks as always to Camille and the team at CPEX for creating this incredible space year after year. I'm going to keep coming. I think we all should keep coming because we are making progress. This is progress, and so give yourselves a hand. I want to remind you that you can pick up CLE forms at the registration table. We are now going into lunch, so please grab your lunch and drink provided by the Coca-Cola Bottling Company. Thank you, Coca-Cola. Near the elevators, once you are done, you can have a seat in the Manship Theater and enjoy your lunch. Have a great rest of the Smart Growth Summit. Thank you.